Welcome to tutorial 6, working with tables and columns. In this chapter, we're going to look at the structure of a web table, create table headings and data cells, apply CSS styles to a table, create cells that span multiple rows and columns, add a caption to a table, create row and column groups, apply styles to the rows and column groups, display page elements in table form, and also create a multi-column layout. So we'll start off looking at the structure of a web table. And it's an example here. We see that the first table row is made up of all header cells. The browser is going to render the web table with bold headers and spanning cells. We also see that, for example, the 6 p.m. national news, 6:30 world news, it spans all of these, or it spans several columns. We'll also see down here that these cells are going to span multiple rows and columns. So they span 2 rows each. And then we have a table caption. So we place it at the bottom right-hand corner of this table. A web table's HTML structure consists of multiple table rows. Each row contains one or more table cells. Using tables is an effective way of organizing and classifying web page contents. And you start with the table element. So your table is going to reside within the table tags. Now the table element is going to have other tags inside of it, other elements such as the TR, which is the table row element. The table contains cells within each row, and the size of the table is going to be defined by the number of table rows and the number of cells within rows. So we'll look at the general structure of a web table. So we start off with our table tags. Notice we have an open and closing table tag. Inside of those is going to be the table elements. So we have our table rows. So we have our TR tag, and we have a closing TR tag. And then we have the table cells. Now this is where our content would go. So looking at this, we have 2 rows located in this. So looking at how this looks within our HTML code. So we have our table tag. In this class, they got the class of schedule. It's going to be applied to this table. Then in here we got our open and closing table row, and another open and closing table row. Now when we look at tables, they support 2 types of cells. You got a header cell. It contains content that's placed at the top of the column or the beginning of the row. Now by default, the text is going to be in bold, and it's going to center it horizontally, and it's going to be marked using the TH element. You also have data cells. These are the ones that be contained within the columns or rows. Text is going to be unformatted by default. It's aligned to the left of the cell. And with this, you're going to use the TD element. So we're looking at the example here. We got our table row, and then here we got our TH, which is our table head. So the TH is going to mark the header cells. And this is going to place the first row for this in this table. And then we come down to another table row, and inside of there we got the THs as well. The data that's going in there is going to be within the TD. So it's going to say that inside this table cell, it's going to consist of this unformatted data. So when we look back at the output of that code, okay, the 6, 6:30, 7, 7:30, the header row, the first row, those will be made up of header cells. National news, world news, Opera Fest, all of this text inside of here, it was made up of the TDs. As we see here. Now, one of the CSS properties you can use is the border property. And what this does is it adds borders to any part of the web table. They don't have to be the same style. So you can use two styles of borders here. You get separate borders or collapsed borders. So we look at the examples of these. The separate borders is going to have a border around each letter, for example, on this one. So it's going to be well defined. While the collapsed borders you'll see is more like a tic-tac-toe symbol for this example. All right, so if you want to choose between these, you can put this you can use the different borders models. You can apply it to the property for the table element. For example, this was border collapse and then top. And top is either going to be separate or collapse. If you use a separate borders model, you can set the spacing between the borders using the border spacing and value. And value is going to be a CSS unit of measurement. On the collapsed borders model, the borders are from form adjacent elements that are merged together to form a single border. So the borders are joined to combine their features. You can use different width, styles, colors, but doing that makes it more complicated. So 5 rules you can use to reconcile the difference between adjacent borders. You can have the border style set to hidden, so the collapsed border is then hidden. If you have the border style set to none, it's overridden by another border style. And also the style with a wider border takes priority over the narrow border if neither border is hidden. So we look at those double borders have a higher precedence, followed by solid, dashed, ridge, onset, groove, and inset. If the only difference, though, is the color, precedence given to borders, and you see the precedent to borders in decreasing orders is borders around individual table cells, borders for table rows, for row groups, columns, column groups, or borders around the entire table. So looking at this, we're reconciling hidden borders here. The first example of the separate borders, in this example here, we see our table is set to border styles are set to hidden, border collapse is set to separate. And then the rest of the settings for the border, 1 pixel solid and blue. So in this one, so the border around the table is going to be hidden. And it's going to show the border around each cell set in blue. To the right, we have the collapsed borders model. Once again, we still have it set to the same settings, except for the border collapse set to collapse instead of separate. And in this one, the collapsed borders model, hidden border around the table is going to take precedence over the blue borders for the individual cells. All right, so sometimes you may want your information to fill more than one cell or one column. So you can use the row span or the column span, and you can add these attributes to the TD or TH element. What this does is it allows that information to expand over the number of preset rows or columns. So your spanning is going to start in the cells with row span or column span attributes, and it's going to cover the cells in the right and below the initial cell. So we set up row span equals to the rows, and the rows is going to be the number of rows the cells occupies, while the column span is equal to columns, and the columns is going to say the number of columns that the cell is going to occupy. So we see here the example, we got the column spans set up for the national news and world news. So what we're saying is that at 6 p.m., the remaining 6 TDs the TD elements, and we'll remove them from the second and third rows and keep the size of 8 total columns. So we're saying span this through 7 columns. Same with this out here. So look at an example of this. In this example here, we got the TD row span 3, and in there we got the number 1, and this cell spans 3 rows. And then we got 2, 3, and 4. This one we got 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So what we've got here is in this is going to span the first 3 rows. Okay, when we got 5, 6, 7, so that's going to take the place of the second row. And then 8, 9, 10 in the third row. We only need that because of the fact that that covers the rows there. But going back to the beginning, let me see what's level 23. So going back to the example here. So we want national news to fill all of these. Okay, so we would have the TD, or excuse me, TR, national news, where we put TD there, national news, and we do call span and have it span like we had in the text here. So we had it saying span 7 rows or 7 columns. And so we have that national news covering that area. And when you create a table caption, you use the caption element, you open it, you put your content in, and then you close the caption. This needs to be listed immediately after the table tag. With this, you only get 1 caption is allowed per web table, and it's going to inherit the text styles associated with the table. Now, by default, they're going to be placed above the tables, but you can also specify the location using the caption side property. And you see the syntax where the caption side and the position. Position is going to be top or bottom. So when we look at this, we've got the caption, all-time central caption. We use in the CSS, the caption side is going to be set to bottom, and then we're going to text align it to the right. So we're going to move it to the right of the area here. So we see here, we got the caption, all-time central. We're going to say, put this at the bottom and align it to the right. And you see that's what we have in our results here. All right, row groups can contain specific table information. And what they do allow you to create different styles for groups or rows. HTML is going to support 3 row groups. You got rows that belong to the table head, and these are marked using with the T head element. You got rows that belong to the table footer, and you'll mark them with the T foot, and then you have the table body, and they'll be marked with a T body element. So this is the general structure of web tables divided into row groups. You have the table tags, you have T head, table rows, T foot, table rows, T body, table rows. Now with these, the T head and T foot element is only allowed once per table. So we're looking at the table groups using still our time, our TV guide. So we got the times that we had, the headers. We're taking those and placing them in the T head group. Okay, down here we've got the T foot, and then we have our T body that have the body element. Column groups. Columns are determined implicitly based on the number of cells within a table row. All right, so our columns are going to be identified with a call element. And to do this, we can use the ID or class attributes to identify individual columns. Now we can also reference the column group element. So we got our open and closed tables. We have our column group there are columns in that. Columns in this situation is going to be individual columns defined within the group. We can also, when we work with this, the column and column groups, they accept only CSS style properties. They allow you to modify the column borders, background, width, and visibility. So we see an example here. We've got the column element referenced in the first column. It's got the ID of first column. And then here we got the column element referenced in the next 7 columns. All right, so we look at our CSS. So the first one, they're going to change the background. So it's going to have a gray background. And then the following one's going to have the pink background. All right, level of precedence in table styles is in decreasing order. You have table cells, rows, row groups, columns, column groups, and tables. You can also work with the width and height. By default, the browser is going to attempt to fit more content in each column before wrapping the cell text. Extra space is going to be divided equally among the columns if the width of the table is larger than the individual columns. And you can set this using the width property. Now, with the height of these rows will be based on the height of the tallest cell. You can use the height style, apply it to table rows within each row group to give a uniform row height. Or you can use the vertical align property used to move the cell text. So see some examples here of setting the width and the height for the width of the columns and the height of the rows. Some other CSS display properties you can use to apply to a table layout. You can use the display table, which leads to the table is treated as a block level element. If you set the display table inline, it's going to be treated as inline element. And then the rest of them, we've got table rows, table row body, table row group, and stuff we've already talked about so far in this lesson. All right, you can also use a definition list. So you can apply styles to this. So we have here our HTML code definition list code. So we have like the DT, in this case it's bandwidth, and then the DD tag is our definition. In this case, it's a measure of data transfer speed over a network. Notice these are in a div tag, so it's just a placeholder. Think of these definition lists really what they are. They are a definition list for when you have a word and then you want to give the definition to it. As you see over here, the example. So we have our words and then the text over here of what the word is. One of the downfalls of tables, they do not scale well to mobile devices. Problems are that either the table is too small to read, it's too big, it doesn't fit in the visual viewport, columns are too narrow to read the cell content. So let's see an example of some problems you have with using tables on mobile devices. As you see, this one is too small to read, this one doesn't fit very well, and this one fits within the viewport, but the columns are going to be too narrow, so the text is going to seem like it drags on forever. So we'll work this. A new layout for table data for mobile screens is required. A lot of table columns are going to be reduced to 2. One column containing all the data labels. The second column is going to contain the data associated with each label. To create a responsive web table, You add the text of data labels as attributes to all the TD elements in the table body. You store the data labels using a data attribute. The general format syntax of the data attribute is the data-text set to the value, which in this case the text is the name of the data attribute and value is the value. Now, the data attributes are going to use names specific to the function that it's used for. So we'll see an example here of the data label. So the data attribute that's named data label is used to store text of the labels associated with the data cell. So we see here in the code we got the table data, data labels equal to date. Then we have our information, April 2nd, 2017. Now, when you do that, the result is the list of data cells are aligned with block elements. And in those block elements, you're going to have the data labels going to be followed by the data cell content. The goal of this is transform tables with multiple columns into a two-column layout. What you see here, it makes it a lot easier for people on mobile devices to read the information. So when you design a column layout, what this does, it allows you the display of the content side by side on the page. It allows you to use either the float elements or flex boxes. Now, when these are used, they're going to look different from column layouts. Single elements, they can flow from one column to the next, and flow of content adjusts to match the page width. You can set the column, the size of the column using the column count property. We see the syntax is the column count and the value. Value is the number of columns in the layout. So we see in our CSS, we got at media only screens, minimum width 614. So we're saying it only applies this to screen devices with a width the only screen with widths more than 641 or 640. So here we're setting the Moz column count, WebKit column count, the column count. So we're looking at the browser extensions, and we set them all to 2. So we're setting all the columns to 2 on this one. Now, by default, these are going to be laid out evenly across the width of the parent element. You can set the column width using the column width property and size. Size is going to be the minimum width of the columns. And what this does is the column width acts like the basis value for the items in the flex box. The column width and column count properties can be combined to form the shorthand columns property. So you see here the syntax of that. We've got columns, width, and count. By default, the gap between the columns is going to be 1 EM. You can set this using the column gap size. And size is going to be the width of the gap in this case. Now, another way you can separate columns is use the graphic dividing line created using the column rule property of column-rule border. This border is going to define the styles of the dividing line. Now you can break this down into other rules like column rule width, column rule style, column rule color. So we see our code here. Once again, they got the column gap set to 30 pixels. Once again, notice that the browser extensions are all set the same. Okay, so they want to no matter whatever browser you're using, it can call all that information in. So if you're using a browser that's not supportive of CSS, it needs that browser extension, the rules still apply to it. Now the size of the column orphans is controlled using the orphan property. So we see the syntax is orphans and value. Value is going to be the minimum number of lines stranded before a column break. Window property value, and that can let you decide the windows column or the column window. Value in this is the minimum number of lines placed after a column break. Some other properties you can use is the break before type and the break after type. In this case, type is going to be either the auto, so it's going to automatically set column breaks. Always is always place a column break, and avoid is to avoid placing column breaks. Now you can also control placement of column breaks with an element using the break inside type property, where the type in this case is going to be auto or avoid. So looking at this, we have our widows set to 3, our orphans set to 3. So in this case, we're saying at least keep 3 lines together after a column break and 3 lines together before a column break. The column span property allows you to span cell columns. Now with this, the span can be set to none to prevent spanning, or all to enable the content to span across all columns. So once again, they set our information up. It's going to use the extensions for this. So it's going to set the heading that extends across all columns. All right, so that's the end of chapter 6.